Hello and welcome to Good Reasons to Believe. I'm Daniel Vecchio and I'll be guest hosting on behalf of Alan Darley. Today I'll be presenting, do ontological arguments provide good reasons to believe? I say ontological arguments, not ontological argument, because there's really a family of related arguments that we'll be discussing. They're basically different forms. Some are conceptual based, some are definitional. I'll try to explain the differences as we go along. Some are modal, and some are experiential. So all sorts of varieties of ontological arguments. And the origin really is traced back to Saint Anselm, the 11th century Archbishop of Canterbury. He composed a work known as the Monologium, where he brought together several cosmological arguments along with arguments meant to clarify and reconcile some of the attributes of God. For instance, how could God be merciful or perfectly merciful and also perfectly just? So he's tried to work out some of the perceived inconsistencies in God's nature. However, he seemed dissatisfied with this approach because it put Christian faith on a complex foundation of interwoven arguments. So we see later on as he develops his proslogium, which is where we find the ontological argument that he formulates, or actually a few versions of that argument where he formulates it in the proslogium. He says, I began to ask myself whether there might be found a single argument which would require no other for its proof than itself alone, and alone would suffice to demonstrate that God truly exists, and that there is a supreme good requiring nothing else, which all other things require for their existence and well-being, and whatever we believe regarding the divine being. So his aim was to sort of provide that foundation with a single argument, and therefore put his Christian faith on firmer foundation. Anselm reports that he set this worry aside of trying to find this single argument, but slowly he became obsessed with the idea. He was beginning to think such a proof would be impossible, and then in a moment of despair he reports that the proof came to him sort of like a inspiration or some sort of lightning flash. Now, something should be said about what an ontological argument is. The word itself, ontological, actually comes from Immanuel Kant, so it's not something Anselm used. But the word itself, ontos, is Greek for being, and logical or comes from the word logos, which has this sense of reasoning or a word about being. So it's an argument that has to do with the being of God somehow. But it's really hard to say what exactly makes an argument an ontological argument, because, again, I mentioned there's a whole family of these proofs. Generally, ontological arguments can be distinguished from other sorts of arguments, like cosmological or teleological arguments or moral arguments, from the fact that the premises are not based on some a posteriori experience, that is, not from something we experience in the world or observe in the world, such as moral experience, design, or causality, or something to that effect. Now, Anselm's argument proceeds from a certain conception of God, and it is worth taking a moment to unpack what this conception is and whether it's an appropriate understanding of God. In this way, I hope to anticipate one question, namely, why think that this proof demonstrates the existence of a Christian God? The short answer to that is that it doesn't. If successful, it would prove the existence of a being that is compatible with the Christian God in much the way it would be compatible with Islamic conception or Jewish conception of God. More broadly, the proof would work for what Graham Oppy has called, and Graham Oppy is one of the great authorities on the ontological argument. He refers to these as proofs for an orthodoxly conceived monotheistic God. So sort of a generic God, not necessarily a deistic or impersonal God, but one that is traditional to the Islamic and Judeo-Christian faiths. Anselm's conception of God, which he argues anyone, including an atheist, can understand, is that God is that than which none greater can be conceived. That's sort of an odd formulation, but we'll try to understand what that means. This understanding of God can be traced back to St. Augustine, who used a similar formulation in a proof against the immateriality, or proof against the materiality of God in Book 6 of the Confessions. Actually, I think it comes up in Book 7, but his issue of materiality comes up in Book 6. And he's arguing that God, since God is that than which none greater can be conceived, or some formulation very similar to that, he says it is greater to be indestructible, and to be indestructible would mean immaterial. So he rejects the notion that God is material on the basis of that definition. We might note then that this sort of would suggest that God is superlative, God is beyond all measure, anything you can conceive of, God would be greater than that, sort of the greatest conceivable being. But more than that, not just a sort of the most great being that you happen to think of, but really that being that sets the upper limit. Nothing can be greater than that. One way to formulate it, I tried to formulate it based on something Graham Oppy says, is that would be like saying for all x, if x and g, say g is God, are not identical, then God is greater than x. G is greater than x. So we can see that this definition dispenses with the Homeric gods, who are conceived of as non-eternal, of limited power, and morally imperfect, oftentimes not even knowing future events or outcomes of wars like the Trojan War. Since St. Anselm was utilizing this definition, he was able to overcome his belief in Manichaeism, which was a materialistic sort of Gnostic religion, dualistic Gnostic religion that was sort of a fusion of Persian religions and Christianity. And so the key for Augustine was to leave what he imagined God to be, sort of leaving behind imagination, which was caught up in the material, and to cling to this pure conception instead. He reasoned that material objects are corruptible, as I said, because they are made of parts, which can come apart. That which is immaterial cannot be corrupted. And to say that God is material is to admit that a God of which none greater can be conceived could be conceived of in a greater way, namely if God was indestructible. And you can start to see how Anselm might use Augustine's argument. Anselm devises a couple of versions of the ontological argument in the Proslogium, so I'm going to try to develop some of them. And each one is based on the same conception. The first argument makes the distinction between things that might exist in the mind alone and things that exist also in reality. Anselm reasons that existing both in the mind and in reality is greater than existing in the mind alone. So if the atheist hears Anselm's conception of God and thinks that this is just a concept in her mind alone, the atheist commits herself to a contradiction, because she has in her understanding this concept, that than which none greater can be conceived, and thinks that whatever it refers to exists in the mind alone, though it would have been greater if it had also existed in reality. So a greater could have been conceived than that which none greater could be conceived. And so that's the contradiction. And so the idea then is that thinking that God is just a concept in your mind leads to absurdity. One question that may be raised is, why think that it is greater to exist in reality? My students often raise examples like cancer or a hurricane or something like that, and they reason that it would be greater if such things were just thought of in the mind and not also in reality. But Anselm means greater in the absolute sense rather than in a relative sense. That is, it would be greater, it might be greater relative to me that I only think I have cancer, but this is precisely because in an absolute sense, the cancer that exists both mentally and physically is far more greater a threat. It's sort of a greater existential threat because it actually can do things. And while the hypochondriac might allow his fears to modify his behaviors, a real cancer patient suffers to a far greater degree. So the idea here is that God that is merely imagined might have real effect on the behavior of a believer, but a real God could do so much more, sustain all of existence, create the cosmos, and so on. As I said, there's a couple of formulations here, so I wanted to also talk about the second formulation that Anselm gives, which in a sense leads to the modal ontological arguments that were formulated in more contemporary times. By modal, we just mean that the argument utilizes reasoning about possibility or contingency and necessity. Anselm reasons that it is possible to conceive of a being which cannot not exist, and this would be greater than a being that can be conceived as not existing. So, for instance, I don't have to exist. You could conceive that I don't exist, but it would be greater to conceive of a being that couldn't fail to exist, and that would be a necessary being. So he says it's possible that there is a being that couldn't fail to exist, and given that, since it would be greater, such a being would actually exist. Let me just say, no argument in the history of philosophy, well, maybe some, but no argument, in my estimation, has been more contentious in the sense that we find major figures across the entire history of philosophy split as to the merit of the argument. Versions of it have been defended by René Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Hegel, Norman Malcolm, Charles Hartshorne, Alvin Plantinga, Robert Maydal, and Alexander Proust, just to name a few. That's not even a complete list. Even some philosophers who are agnostic about God, whether God exists, have defended certain versions of the argument. For instance, the great mathematician Kurt Gödel and the philosopher Richard Gale. So it's interesting that they see some sort of merit in the argument, even if they don't find it completely compelling to theistic belief. And I should say something about what I mean by compelling or successful argument versus a sound argument or a valid argument, because I think that can occasion some confusion, and the clarification on that point will help explain my position with regard to this argument. By a valid argument, logicians typically just mean that given the premises, the conclusion follows necessarily. So there's sort of a formal way in which the conclusion follows. When a philosopher says that an argument is sound, they mean that the premises are true and the argument is valid. And given those two conditions, there's a certitude that the conclusion will be true. Now, an argument could be sound and still be considered a philosophical failure. And that would be if the premises, even if they're true, are not given sufficient warrant for a sort of impartial person to accept them as true. So in other words, they might be true premises, but an agnostic person, a person who doesn't know one way or another, might not have any good reasons to accept them as true. So many philosophers that I'll list here, some of them say the argument simply doesn't work, and others say that the argument is unsound. So some say it's not a success, others say it's unsound. I'm thinking of philosophers like, surprisingly to some maybe, Thomas Aquinas rejects the argument, John Locke, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, and of course Graham Oppy, who I referenced earlier. And Graham Oppy actually, he wrote a book back in the 90s, The Ontological Argument and Belief in God. And in that, he argues that the ontological argument's a complete failure, doesn't work. But then later on, in a subsequent book about arguing about gods, he revises that position and says that he can only say that arguments that have put forward so far have not been successful, but he can't say that it's impossible that a successful argument might not be made. Obviously, I will not be able to discuss all the various formulations of the argument throughout history, so I'd like to discuss only a few such arguments and recommend to my audience Graham Oppy's book, as I mentioned. That gives a systematic treatment of all of the various forms of the argument. Oppy concludes, as I said, that he doesn't think that these are successful. So that's why it's important to understand what that means. He's not saying that this is definitively unsound. He just doesn't think that they're successful. Also, Robert Modal wrote an article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Philosophy. It's a very nice summary of some of the arguments, and he also presents his own version there. So I recommend that as well for those who are interested. Now, what should we say about Anselm's argument? First, we should not say that the argument is, strictly speaking, invalid. You can formulate the Anselmian argument in a valid form. Some philosophers say validity is cheap. Furthermore, it is difficult to say exactly where the problem lies. But one response was ventured by a contemporary of Anselm named Gonilo. He offered a parody of the argument in an attempt to show that it proved too much. So he suggested that there was a lost island than which none greater can be conceived. And surely this island, this perfect island, would have the greatest amount of coconuts and other tropical delights. But it surely would exist among those things if it's that than which none greater could be conceived. And so Guinilo's point is you could adapt and parody the ontological argument to prove the existence of any number of things and conclude that those things actually exist. But Anselm was not without response. He noted that this conception is not something that can be fitted willy-nilly to just any object. It is only fittingly applied to God, he thought. As we saw, Augustine used the argument to prove that God is immaterial. So would this island also be immaterial, you might wonder? Would it be omnipotent, conscious, morally perfect? If so, it really isn't an island, though you might call it that or refer to it as an island for some strange reason. And if it doesn't have those particular great-making properties, those attributes, then you could say, why would you say that this island is that than which none greater can be conceived? Is it material then, surrounded by water? Why would you say then that it has to be great with respect to existing in reality? We might also ask, how many trees would it have? How large would it be? There are reasons to doubt the success of Guinilo's parody then. But this is not the only objection to the argument. Oppy suggests that Aquinas correctly diagnosed the problem with the conceptual version of the argument that Anselm gave, that one cannot infer the existence of a thing from the very concept of it. Actually, William Rowe also, in Philosophy of Religion and Introduction, he gives a very similar defense from Aquinas, basically saying that if you put existence into the concept of a thing, that doesn't mean that there is any instance of it. So he finds it very dubious. Perhaps the most well-known objection to the ontological argument comes from Immanuel Kant. He is responding to the definitional versions of the argument arising out of Descartes' meditation. Descartes formulates it simply and sweetly that God is a being that has all perfections. Existence is a perfection, therefore God has existence. Descartes uses the analogy that the idea of God and God's existence are as inseparable as a mountain is from its valley. Kant's objection is to point out that existence is not a real predicate, so it cannot be enumerated among the perfections of God. Kant's example is that 100 imagined dollars could not have a cent more than 100 real dollars. According to Kant, saying of something that it exists adds nothing to the concept. This objection is taken up into the history of philosophy and led to Frege's proposition that existence is a second-order property, that is to say, property of proposition functions rather than things. So, for instance, when I say there's $100, I'm really saying that the property of being $100 is instantiated. I'm going to have to jump ahead a little bit and talk about these modal versions. The modal version of the ontological argument essentially says that God is a necessary being by definition, and if that being possibly exists, then by axiom S5 and modal logic, God would actually exist. Now, this is contentious primarily not for the modal axioms used, but why think God is possible. And I don't have too much time to talk about that right now, but what we could say is that the ontological argument ultimately will depend upon whether or not you can give good reason to think God is possible. I'm not sure that we can give good reason to someone who doesn't already accept God's existence. In that sense, we might say that the conclusion and the premise of any of these ontological arguments are a little too close, as Plantinga would say. But I would say that for my experience, the way I experience God, and the way I feel obligated, say, to worship God, that from that I feel that duty to worship and to give thanks to God, and that for me, that obligation implies that I can do it, as Kant says ought implies can. So ultimately I would end my reflection this way, and I realize that this was a brief summary, but that the ontological arguments can give not so much a proof that God exists, but can reinforce a worldview where God seems possible. It seems possible to worship God, and that reinforces the reason to think that God actually can be worshipped and God actually exists. So we're going to have to leave it at that, unfortunately. I've run out of time to discuss all of these arguments. They're wonderful arguments, and I would highly recommend that you study them. They have philosophical merit. Through them, logic has developed. We see that Frege, who rejected the argument, helped to devise predicate logic through that rejection. We see that Plantinga helped develop many notions of modal logic in response to the ontological argument. So it's definitely a philosophically fruitful idea, and I think it has theological implications as well. So I'm going to leave it at that for now.